the avoidant misses you. They think about you constantly, replay memories of your time together, wonder how you're doing, feel the absence of your presence in their life like a physical ache. The missing is real and intense and sometimes overwhelming to their nervous system. But they stay silent. They don't reach out, don't express what they're feeling, don't bridge the distance their own patterns created. This silence is deeply confusing because you'd think that missing someone would naturally lead to contact, that wanting someone would overcome fear of vulnerability, that longing for connection would motivate reaching out. But with avoidance, the relationship between missing you and reaching out is complicated by layers of defense mechanisms, identity protection, and core wounds that make silence feel safer than connection even when the silence is painful and isolating. Understanding why avoidants stay silent despite missing you helps you stop taking their silence personally and recognize it as information about their internal world rather than evidence of your importance or lack thereof to them. The silence isn't about you not mattering. It's about them being unable to express that you matter because expressing it feels too dangerous to their defended sense of self. Here's what's actually happening inside the avoidant who misses you desperately but stays completely silent about it. They're protecting themselves from potential rejection. The primary reason avoidants stay silent when they miss you is fear of rejection. Reaching out means risking that you won't respond, that you've moved on, that you're angry about how things ended, that you'll reject their attempt at reconnection. This potential rejection feels unbearable to the avoidant because it would confirm their deepest fear that they're unlovable, that people leave once they really know them, that their patterns make them too difficult to want. So they stay silent to avoid experiencing the rejection that would devastate their already fragile sense of self-worth. The fear of rejection is often disproportionate to the actual likelihood of rejection. You might still care about them, you might welcome hearing from them, but the avoidance wounds make them catastrophize outcomes. They imagine the worst possible responses to reaching out, and those imagined scenarios feel so threatening that silence seems like the only safe option. Subscribe for insights into attachment psychology that help you understand these patterns without taking them personally or making them mean something about your worth. They'd rather live with the longing and uncertainty of silence than risk the definitive pain of being told you don't want to hear from them. The rejection protection also includes avoiding the vulnerability of admitting they miss you only to discover you don't miss them. If they reach out and you're indifferent, if you've clearly moved on without difficulty, if you don't share their feelings of loss and longing, that asymmetry would be humiliating. The avoidant stays silent to protect themselves from the shame of revealing they're more affected than you are, more attached than you were, more stuck in the loss than you've been. The silence maintains the possibility that you miss them too, whereas reaching out might reveal you're completely fine without them. They're waiting for you to make the first move. Avoidants often stay silent because they're hoping you'll reach out first. If you initiate contact, they don't have to risk rejection. If you break the silence, it proves you still care without them having to be vulnerable. If you come to them, they can respond without having to take the scary step of pursuing. The avoidant is essentially waiting for you to do the emotional labor of reconnection so they can benefit from contact without having to face their fears about initiating it. This waiting reveals the avoidant's passivity in relationships. They want connection, but they want it to happen without them having to actively pursue it. They want you to want them enough to overcome the distance and make contact despite how things ended. If you reach out first, It gives them information about your feelings without them having to expose their own. They can gauge your interest, test the waters, see if reconnection is possible without putting themselves on the line first. The waiting also means the avoidant is stuck in a pattern where they need evidence of your continued interest before they'll show theirs. They can't trust that reaching out would be welcomed, so they need you to prove through your actions that it would be. But this creates a standoff where both people are waiting for the other to make the first move. The avoidant interprets your silence as disinterest when it might be self-protection or respect for the boundaries they set. Meanwhile, you interpret their silence as not missing you when the opposite is true. They don't know what to say. The avoidant stays silent because they genuinely don't know what to say that would adequately express what they're feeling without being too vulnerable. They can't say, "I miss you," without feeling exposed. They can't explain why they're reaching out without admitting their patterns were the problem. They can't start a conversation without potentially having to engage in the emotional processing they've been avoiding. So they say nothing because anything they could say feels either inadequate or too revealing. The not knowing what to say comes from the avoidant's limited emotional vocabulary and comfort with emotional expression. They feel things intensely, but they don't have language for those feelings. They experience missing you as a physical ache, an emptiness, a constant low-level discomfort. But translating that experience into words that could be sent in a text or said in a conversation feels impossible. They don't know how to bridge the gap between their internal experience and external communication without revealing vulnerability that terrifies them. The communication paralysis also includes the avoidant not knowing what they want from reaching out. Do they want to get back together? Do they just want to know you're okay? Do they want closure? Do they want to maintain some kind of connection? Without clarity about their own intentions, they can't formulate a message that makes sense. They're stuck in a state of missing you without knowing what they want to do about that missing, and the confusion keeps them silent because reaching out without knowing what they want feels reckless. They're ashamed of their patterns and behavior. A significant reason for the silence is shame about how they acted during and after the relationship. The avoidant knows they hurt you through their patterns. They know they withdrew, were inconsistent, created pain through their emotional unavailability. They're ashamed of those behaviors, and the shame makes reaching out feel like it requires apologizing, taking responsibility, admitting fault. These things are incredibly difficult for someone whose entire identity is built on being capable and not needing anyone. The shame keeps them silent because breaking the silence means confronting what they did wrong. The shame is particularly acute if the avoidant has gained insight into their patterns since the relationship ended. Maybe they've been in therapy, read about attachment, talked to friends who've helped them see their role in the dynamic. This increased awareness makes them realize how badly they handled things, how much they hurt you, how their defensive behaviors destroyed something valuable. The guilt and shame of this recognition makes them feel they don't deserve to reach out, that they've forfeited the right to your attention, that contacting you would be selfish when they've already caused enough pain. The shame-based silence also protects the avoidant from having to face your potential anger or hurt. If they reach out, you might tell them how much they hurt you. You might express anger about their behavior. You might hold them accountable for their patterns. All of this feels threatening to the avoidant's fragile ego. They'd rather stay silent than face the consequences of their actions through your justified emotional responses. The silence lets them avoid accountability while still maintaining the fantasy that reconnection might be possible someday. They're convincing themselves you're better off without them. The avoidant stays silent because they've constructed a narrative where their absence is actually good for you. They tell themselves you deserve better than what they could offer. They convince themselves that you're happier without their inconsistent presence. They frame their silence as a gift to you, protecting you from their patterns, letting you move on to someone more capable of meeting your needs. This narrative makes the silence feel noble rather than cowardly. The better off story is a defense mechanism that protects the avoidant from the guilt of missing you but not changing. If they reach out, they might reconnect, but then fall back into the same patterns. They know they haven't done enough work to be different, so they tell themselves that staying away is the loving choice, that you need to be with someone who can actually show up consistently. This framing allows them to maintain their self-image as a good person who cares about you even while they're causing pain through absence and silence. The narrative also reveals the avoidant's fixed mindset about their own capacity for change. They believe they are who they are, that their patterns are unchangeable, that they'll always be emotionally unavailable and inconsistent. From this belief, reaching out feels cruel because it would give you hope for something they're convinced they can't provide. The silence is their way of accepting what they see as inevitable incompatibility, rather than doing the hard work of actually changing to become compatible. They're testing if you'll move on without them. Part of why the avoidant stays silent is they're testing whether you'll move on, and perversely, they want evidence that you will. If you move on easily, it confirms their belief that they weren't that important, that their leaving didn't really matter, that people don't actually need them. But if you struggle to move on, if you reach out, if you show signs of missing them, it proves they mattered and had impact. The avoidant is using silence to gather information about their significance to you. This testing is contradictory and self-sabotaging. The avoidant wants to matter to you, but they also want confirmation that people are fine without them, because that confirmation justifies their defensive independence. They stay silent, hoping you'll both struggle without them and move on successfully. When these contradictory outcomes are both what they're looking for, no outcome satisfies them. If you reach out, they feel smothered. If you don't reach out, they feel abandoned. The test is designed to confirm their wounded worldview regardless of results. The testing through silence also allows the avoidant to maintain control. As long as they don't reach out, they're the one deciding the terms of contact. They're the one who holds the power to reconnect or not. If they reached out, they'd be surrendering that control and making themselves vulnerable to your response. The silence keeps them in the driver's seat, even while it prevents them from going anywhere they actually want to go. They believe time and distance will make the longing go away. The avoidant stays silent because they believe that if they just wait long enough, the missing will fade and they'll stop wanting to reach out. They think time will heal the attachment, that distance will make you less important, that eventually they'll stop thinking about you and the urge to contact you will disappear. They're essentially waiting out their own feelings, believing silence is temporary until the feelings change rather than recognizing the feelings might not change without action. This belief in time healing the longing is based on the avoidance experience with past relationships where they did eventually stop thinking about people they left. What they don't recognize is that those relationships were different, that you might be different, that the depth of connection might mean these feelings don't fade the way previous ones did. The avoidant is applying old patterns to a new situation and waiting for an outcome that might never come. The waiting also becomes its own trap. The longer the silence continues, the harder it becomes to break. Each day of not reaching out makes reaching out feel more awkward, more difficult to explain, more likely to be rejected because so much time has passed. The avoidant gets stuck in a pattern where they're waiting for the right time, but the right time never comes because every day that passes makes the silence more entrenched and harder to overcome. They're overwhelmed by their own emotions. Sometimes the avoidant stays silent simply because they're overwhelmed by the intensity of missing you and don't know how to function with that level of emotion. Missing you brings up all the feelings they spent the relationship avoiding: longing, attachment, need, vulnerability, desire for closeness. These emotions flood their system, and instead of reaching out, they shut down. The silence is emotional paralysis, an inability to act because they're too dysregulated by their own internal experience. The overwhelm includes the avoidant not being able to separate missing you from all the other complicated feelings that come with it. They miss you, but they're also scared of intimacy. They want to reach out, but they're also terrified of commitment. They long for connection, but they're also protective of their independence. These conflicting feelings create internal chaos that makes clear action impossible. So they stay frozen in silence, unable to move toward you because moving toward you activates all their fears and defenses. The emotional overwhelm also means the avoidant is likely engaging in numbing behaviors to avoid feeling the missing. They might be working excessively, drinking, pursuing casual relationships, staying constantly busy. These distractions help them avoid the full force of missing you, but they also prevent them from reaching out because reaching out would require feeling everything they're working so hard not to feel. The silence is maintained by active avoidance of the emotional experience that would motivate breaking it. They're hoping you'll wait for them to be ready. The avoidant stays silent but secretly hopes you'll wait for them to work through their issues and become capable of the relationship you deserved. They want time to go to therapy, heal their wounds, develop emotional availability. They imagine a future where they've done the work and come back to you as a better version of themselves. This fantasy allows them to stay silent now while maintaining hope for reconnection later when they're ready. The hope that you'll wait is deeply unfair to you, but the avoidant doesn't fully recognize this. They believe that if the connection was real, you'll still be available when they're finally capable of showing up for it. They don't understand that asking you to wait indefinitely while they may or may not do the work to change is asking you to put your life on hold for someone who's giving you nothing. The silence is the avoidance way of keeping you as an option without having to commit to you or to their own growth. The fantasy of future readiness also becomes an excuse to avoid present action. The avoidant can stay silent indefinitely by telling themselves they're not ready yet, they need more time, they have to work on themselves first. This framing makes the silence feel temporary and purposeful when it might actually be permanent avoidance. They might never be ready, and the silence allows them to avoid confronting that possibility by always deferring to a future that may never come. What the silence actually accomplishes. The avoidance silence, while protective of their ego in the short term, ultimately accomplishes the opposite of what they want. They stay silent to avoid rejection, but the silence itself creates the distance that makes you move on, effectively ensuring the rejection they were trying to avoid. They stay silent, hoping you'll wait, but the silence communicates disinterest, making it less likely you'll be available when and if they're ready. They stay silent to protect themselves from vulnerability, but the silence creates regret and longing that's more painful than the vulnerability of reaching out would have been. The silence also robs both of you of the possibility of resolution, clarity, or reconnection. Maybe you would have welcomed hearing from them. Maybe you still have feelings that could be explored. Maybe there's healing that could happen through honest conversation. But the silence forecloses all these possibilities. The avoidance protection mechanism becomes a prison that keeps them stuck in a painful limbo where they miss you but can't have you because they won't reach out. The tragic irony is that the avoidant silence often creates exactly what they're most afraid of. They're afraid of rejection, so they stay silent, but the silence makes rejection inevitable as you eventually move on. They're afraid of vulnerability, so they don't reach out, but the longing and regret they experience in silence is more vulnerable than any conversation would have been. They're afraid of losing themselves in connection, so they maintain distance, but the distance creates a loss of you that hurts more than connection ever could have. The silence is supposed to protect them, but it ends up destroying the very thing they want to protect: the possibility of having you in their life. Understanding this doesn't mean you should wait for them to break the silence, or that you should reach out yourself. It simply helps you recognize that their silence is about their fears and limitations, not about your value or the significance of what you shared.